The energy relationship between Canada and the United States has always been close but never equal. For years, the US has operated with a quiet assumption that Canadian oil, particularly Alberta's heavy crude, would always be there. Dependable, predictable, affordable, a steady northbound tap to keep American refineries humming. But that assumption has just been shaken, and not lightly. Alberta's premier made it clear Canada is ready to reroute up to 2 million barrels of oil per day away from the US.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
That's not a bluff, that's a warning. And it lands at a time when the US energy system is already stretched thin, structurally vulnerable, and tangled in its own web of tariffs and inconsistent policy. This statement wasn't just about oil. It was about power. And it exposed the reality of the relationship. The US depends on Canadian heavy crude far more than Canada depends on US buyers. That dependence is especially concentrated in US Midwest refineries in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania that are calibrated specifically for Canadian blends. There's no easy substitute. Light US shale oil doesn't cut it for these systems. So any threat to Canadian supply, be it through tariffs, trade tensions, or a deliberate rerouting, hits hard. That's the structural flaw that Alberta's warning revealed. The US isn't prepared for a sudden shift in Canadian supply strategy, and Canada knows it. Meanwhile, Canada has been quietly preparing for this moment. While the US energy sector wrestles with political infighting, unpredictable tariffs, and stalled infrastructure, Canada has been building something different: leverage. And that leverage looks like liquefied natural gas. LNG is where the shift becomes undeniable. Canada's LNG sector is no longer just a plan, it's an active, heavily funded, globally integrated strategy. Projects like LNG Canada Phase 2 and the KC Lisms Initiative are pulling in billions in investment, not based on speculation, but on long-term demand projections, particularly from Asia, where energy demand is booming, and Europe, which is actively seeking to diversify away from Russian gas. The Pacific coast gives Canada a natural advantage here. LNG exports to Asia from British Columbia can reach their destinations faster and at lower cost than shipments from the US Gulf Coast. That's not just convenience, that's global competitiveness. And with new infrastructure being developed, those shorter routes are going to matter more than ever. This is what energy diversification actually looks like. And Canada is playing it smart. By expanding LNG infrastructure, securing long-term contracts, and smoothing the permitting process, Canada is creating an investment environment that looks stable and that's attracting major global players. In contrast, the US energy sector is running into bureaucratic bottlenecks, political gridlock, and trade policy swings that undermine investor confidence. So when Alberta says they're prepared to redirect oil, they're not bluffing. They're building an alternative, one that doesn't run through the US market, one that can't be held hostage by tariffs, one that makes Canadian energy policy independent in a way it hasn't been in decades. And it's working. The US, for all its domestic production, still leans heavily on Canada for the kind of crude that many of its refineries require. And here's the part that stings. Even if the US wanted to pivot, the infrastructure isn't there. You can't retrofit massive refining complexes overnight. You can't import Venezuelan heavy crude at scale without triggering sanctions. And OPEC, not exactly known for reliable partnerships. So where does that leave the US? Exposed, specifically in the Midwest, where those refineries would feel the price shocks and supply disruptions first. That's not just an economic inconvenience, it's a national security concern. What's unfolding now is a recalibration of energy leverage. For decades, US policymakers used trade measures, especially tariffs, as a way to maintain pressure on allies and competitors alike. But tariffs don't work when the partner on the other side is holding all the cards. And right now, Canada is holding more than ever. The US can threaten duties, it can delay permits, but it can't force Canada to prioritize a market that's become less stable and less profitable. Not when there are billions on the table from Asia and Europe, and not when Canada has already begun shifting its infrastructure to serve those very regions. That's the quiet power of diversification. It takes time to build, but once it's there, it's hard to reverse. And for the US, that means confronting a difficult truth: the era of assuming Canadian compliance.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Is over. What's coming next isn't a dramatic rupture. It's a slow, steady redirection of flows. Canada isn't slamming the door, but it is pointing to the exit. The US can stay in the room, but the terms are changing, and the geopolitical implications are massive. For one, energy security is no longer just about oil production, it's about access, infrastructure, and international demand. Canada, once seen as a junior partner in North American energy, is stepping into a global role. And with every LNG terminal built, with every new shipping route secured, its dependency on US demand shrinks. That means the US will need to rethink its strategy. It can't afford to treat Canadian energy as a permanent fixture. It can't rely on leverage that doesn't exist anymore. And it definitely can't continue underinvesting in its own infrastructure while hoping Canada keeps filling the gaps. Because that gap, it's closing. For Canada, this is about long-term resilience. Energy diversification isn't just smart economics, it's strategic defense. And it comes at a moment when global energy markets are being restructured. Europe is moving away from Russian gas. Asia is hungry for secure LNG. And the US is learning that being a producer doesn't guarantee control. The question now isn't whether the US will lose influence in North American energy, it's how fast, and whether it can adapt before it becomes a secondary player in a region it used to dominate. Alberta's statement was the spark, but the fire was already burning. And now, with LNG expansion underway and investment pouring in, the path forward is clear. Canada isn't looking back. If you've been following the US-Canada energy relationship like it's business as usual, it's time to update that playbook. The market isn't waiting. The investments are happening. The infrastructure is being built. And the US, it's reacting slowly and from behind. If this story helped you see the bigger picture, tap the like button. Share this with someone who still thinks Canada's just the oil up north. Leave a comment, how do you think this shift will reshape North American energy politics? And don't forget to subscribe, we'll be watching this transformation unfold. And you'll want to be here when the next shock hits. Let's keep going, because this shift isn't subtle, it's historic. Alberta didn't just float an idea to redirect 2 million barrels of oil a day from the US to other markets. That wasn't a headline grab. It was a shout across the bow of decades of North American energy assumptions. For years, the US has operated under the illusion that Canada would always be the reliable junior partner. Steady supply, predictable behavior, quiet cooperation. But Alberta's warning, backed by hard numbers and real infrastructure investment, revealed the truth. Canada doesn't need to keep playing by those rules anymore. And here's why that matters, because the US system was built on that old assumption. Midwest refineries are optimized for one thing: Canadian heavy crude. This isn't something that can be swapped out like a filter. These refineries are designed, structurally and chemically, to process that specific type of oil. If Canada cuts or reroutes its supply, the US doesn't just lose oil, it loses processing capacity, supply chain efficiency, and ultimately, economic stability. Let's be blunt, there is no short-term fix. Domestic US production is overwhelmingly light sweet crude. It's great for exports, but not a match for those heavy crude refineries. Venezuela, off limits, thanks to sanctions. Mexico, not producing at the necessary scale. OPEC, unreliable at best, hostile at worst. This puts the US in a bind. It's like owning a fleet of luxury sports cars, but all the gas stations nearby are running diesel. That's what dependency looks like. And Alberta just reminded Washington that it holds the nozzle. Meanwhile, Canada's not sitting idle. It's moving fast. LNG is the new frontier, and Canada is staking its claim. Projects like LNG Canada Phase 2 and KC Listens aren't theoretical, they're shovel in the ground, investment-backed, future-proof infrastructure plays. Billions of dollars are flowing in, not just because Canada has the gas, but because it has the route. Western Canada has a direct, shorter path to Asia through the Pacific. That's a shipping advantage the US Gulf Coast can't match. And for energy-hungry nations like Japan, South Korea, and India, time and cost matter. Canada is building capacity to serve those markets directly. No middleman. No rerouting through US ports. This shift isn't just about money, it's about control. For the first time in modern energy history, Canada has the leverage. And it's using it to build a future where it's no longer locked into American demand. That future includes streamlined permitting, investor confidence, and a policy environment that prioritizes long-term returns over political gamesmanship. Investors are noticing. The money isn't going to unpredictability, it's going to certainty. And right now, Canada looks a lot more certain than the US. let's talk policy for a second. U.S. tariffs were once a powerful tool used to pressure, punish, and steer trade behavior. But that tool is losing its edge. Because what do tariffs do when your partner has alternatives? Not much. You can't strong-arm a country into shipping you oil if they've got buyers lined up in Tokyo, Seoul, and Berlin. That's not leverage. That's desperation. And that's exactly what Canada is preparing for. Not confrontation but independence. The right to choose its markets, set its terms, and protect its interests. The US used to assume that Canadian energy would always flow south by default. That assumption is now broken. But here's what makes this shift truly consequential. It's not just about oil and gas. It's about the structure of North American energy. If the US can't guarantee access to the crude its refineries are built to use, then its entire downstream infrastructure, refining, distribution, pricing gets shaky. Midwest fuel prices become more volatile. Strategic reserves become less useful. And energy security becomes a much bigger question. This is what Alberta's statement really revealed, the fragility beneath the surface. The U.S. energy system looks strong but it's deeply exposed. One province in Canada makes a policy shift, and suddenly the world's largest economy is forced to reconsider its options. And that brings us to the broader geopolitical picture. Energy isn't just about consumption, it's about influence. For decades, the U.S. used energy dominance as a pillar of its global clout. Exporting LNG, controlling oil trade flows, setting benchmarks. But that only works when your own supply chains are locked down. When you're no longer the one in control, your influence erodes. Canada is stepping into that vacuum, not to replace the US but to become a player in its own right. And with Asia and Europe actively looking to reduce dependency on authoritarian regimes and diversify their energy portfolios, Canada is showing up at exactly the right time. This realignment reshapes how the world sees North American energy. It's no longer US-centric. It's no longer one-directional. And it's no longer safe to assume that Washington sets the rules. What happens next will depend on how fast both countries adjust. For Canada, the roadmap is clear. Invest, export, expand. For the US, it's less certain. It will need to rethink refinery strategy, stabilize trade policy, and probably finally start treating Canadian energy not as an entitlement but as a partnership. Because that's the heart of this story. The dynamic is changing. The roles are shifting. And the US isn't at the center anymore. This isn't speculation. This is infrastructure being built, deals being signed, pipelines being rerouted, and statements being made that don't leave much to interpretation. Alberta wasn't vague. They said what they meant. 2 million barrels a day ready to go elsewhere. So where does that leave the US? On defense, scrambling to protect a position it thought was guaranteed, and forced to reckon with a hard truth: the energy world doesn't revolve around it anymore. Let's get into the long-term consequences because Alberta's warning wasn't just a temporary tremor in energy markets. It's the start of a long, deliberate shift, a signal that Canada is done playing the background role in the North American energy story. And now, the United States is no longer the default audience for Canada's resources. It's just one market among many. That's a reality the US has never really had to face before. For decades, it's operated from a position of energy dominance, especially in its own neighborhood. Canadian oil, always available, pipelines, flowing south, tariffs, a tool to lean on allies without much risk of blowback. But that entire playbook starts to fall apart when Canada says, actually, we have other options now. The old logic went like this: Canada lacked diversified energy export routes, so the US didn't have to worry. Sure, Alberta had oil. Sure, British Columbia had gas. But if everything flowed through US pipelines, ports, and refineries, then Washington held the cards. That's not how it works anymore. Because what's really happening beneath the headlines, beyond the political theater, is structural. Canada is actively decoupling its energy strategy from US dependency. And it's doing so with a clarity and speed that should worry any American policymaker still clinging to 1990s era assumptions. LNG terminals on the Pacific coast, being built. Permits, fast-tracked, long-term contracts with Asia, already in motion. Investment from international markets, pouring in. Meanwhile, U.S. policy on energy infrastructure remains stuck. Tariffs threaten cross-border collaboration. Pipeline projects stall in legal limbo. And political volatility scares off long-term investors. So while the U.S. debates, Canada builds. And Alberta's announcement about redirecting to million barrels of oil wasn't a random number. It's the kind of volume that could cause a serious shock to Midwest refineries that depend on Canadian supply. Refineries that are engineered specifically to handle heavy crude, the kind that the US doesn't produce in abundance. Let's be very clear. The US can't just swap in domestic shale oil and expect everything to work. These systems are finely tuned. The machinery, the chemistry, the processing specs, it all depends on heavy crude. Without it, those refineries either run less efficiently or shut down entirely. And if that happens, gas prices rise, diesel prices spike, transportation costs ripple through the economy. All of that triggered not by a war, not by sanctions, not by OPEC, but by a policy shift in Alberta. That's leverage. The US is discovering that it's not just supply that matters, it's where that supply wants to go. And right now, Canada wants to go global. Asia is the golden opportunity. Europe is the urgent need, and Canada has the geography to meet both. The Pacific coast gives it shorter shipping times to Asia than the US Gulf. The Atlantic routes make LNG exports to Europe viable as that continent scrambles to cut ties with Russian energy. That's why projects like LNG Canada and KC Listums aren't just regional plays. They're part of a global strategy. A strategy that leaves the US on the sidelines if it doesn't adapt. This is the pivot point. The US has built its energy posture around assumptions that no longer hold. That Canada will always sell primarily to America. Every one of those assumptions is eroding. And if the US doesn't rework its policies to reflect this new reality, it's going to lose more than influence. It's going to lose security, stability, and investor confidence in its own energy market. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If Canada redirects even a portion of its oil and gas away from the US, there is no backup plan, no excess capacity sitting around, no underutilized refineries waiting to be flipped on. The US energy infrastructure, especially in the Midwest, was built around Canadian crude. That's why the Keystone Pipeline was such a hot topic. It's why supply disruptions always hit hardest in that corridor. Now add this to the equation. US policy uncertainty is making things worse. Fluctuating tariffs, permitting delays, pipeline politics. None of it inspires investor confidence. And without long-term investment, infrastructure doesn't evolve. That's where Canada is pulling ahead. By streamlining its regulatory processes and actively courting foreign investment, Canada is positioning itself as a stable, attractive partner for global energy demand. LNG investors aren't just looking for volume, they're looking for reliability. That's not strategy. That's denial. If this breakdown helped clarify the stakes, go ahead and hit like. Share this video with someone who still thinks Canadian oil is locked into the US forever. And tell us in the comments, how do you think this reshuffling of power will change North American energy for the next decade? And if you want to stay ahead of stories like this, ones that expose the shifts before they hit the headlines, subscribe. Because this isn't just a trend. It's the next era of energy. And it's already underway. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, you're officially part of the small percentage of people who don't just click away, and that means a lot. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts, your ideas, or even what you'd like to see next. I read every single one of them, and your feedback genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If you enjoyed the video, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content is worth sharing. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. We've got more exciting videos coming, and trust me, you'll want to be here for them. This channel is just getting started, and your support helps it grow faster than you realize. Thank you again for spending a part of your day here with me. Stay curious, stay motivated, and as always, take care of yourself. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.